Good morning, Mr. Hackney.
Good morning.
Welcome to the conference. I can confirm I can see you well, hear you well. Can you see the screen that's being shown from the room?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Wonderful. So you're all set. So thank you. If you can now mute yourself and turn off your camera. And there's instructions in the chat. For any difficulties, please let us know there.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, panel, and participants. I just want to start. I'm Council Jim Cody, Council for the BC Utilities Commission for this hearing, and I have a couple of public and other safety announcements to make to start our meeting. First of all, for everyone, washrooms are located to the immediate right as you exit the door to this room. Emergency exits are located throughout the building and marked by lighted signs and placards. The closest emergency exit is at the end of the hall to the immediate right of this room, C575. A reminder for those inside the room connecting to the MS Teams meeting, please ensure you are not connected to audio. For those in the room who will be coming up to the podium to speak, please keep in mind that the microphones are pushed to speak. That concludes the announcements. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cody. Nothing about seatbelts?
No, I can speak about fire extinguishers.
Okay, thank you. All good? All right. Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me all right? Good. Welcome to this morning's procedural conference to consider various matters related to BC Hydro's optional time of use residential rate application. My name is Dave Morton, and I'm the chair of the panel assigned to hear this application. With me are Commissioners Anna Fung on my right and Tom Losky on my left. The purpose of today's procedural conference is to provide parties with the opportunity to present their views on the appropriate regulatory process going forward. By letter, Exhibit A6, dated July 18th, 2023, the panel invited participants in this conference to make oral submissions on the following matters: whether there's a need for further written or oral process on any topics and why, any significant time constraints and or periods of unavailability which should be taken into consideration when establishing the timetable going forward, and any other relevant procedural matters that you wish to bring to the attention of the panel that will assist us all in the efficient and effective review of this application. After considering your submissions, the panel intends to issue a procedural order, including a procedural timetable in due course, but we will endeavor to get it out as quickly as possible, and that will address the matters that are the subject of today's conference. I'd like to ask you to please make sure your submissions are directed to the issues that I've just outlined, together with any other issues that you or any other participants identify, and that the panel accepts as appropriate for addition to the agenda. In identifying any additional issues, please bear in mind that the purpose or goal of the conference is not to compare or discuss the merits of the application, but to address the procedural issues I've just described. In our view, these issues are most effectively canvassed collectively as opposed to issue by issue, but if you disagree, please let us know when you make your appearance. After appearances, the order of submissions will begin with BC Hydro and then follow the order of appearances. Once we reach the end of the list, we'll beginning with the last intervener to speak. Interveners have a right of reply to other submissions in reverse order. And if staff has any submissions, they will make their submissions at the very end after the first run through of the list and we get to the last intervener. So that would give BC Hydro the final right of reply. As you enter your appearance, please spell and state your name for the record, the party you represent, and identify any additional issues at that time. Please also advise whether you prefer the issues be dealt with together, or if you recommend separate submissions, or if you have any separate submission on any issue. We have a number of parties attending virtually by Teams, and I would ask you to please keep your microphones muted unless you are called upon to speak. And since we're dealing with technology, I can't promise everything will go smoothly, although Ezekiel, our tech support, promises it will. And I'm certainly hopeful that it will. In a worst case scenario, if we lose any party, I'll temporarily adjourn the conference so we can regroup. I would like to remind the virtual attendees that if they do experience internet connection issues during the conference, please phone into the meeting. The call-in instructions are included in the email invitation that you received for this meeting. I'd like to remind everyone that the conference is being transcribed and it's being webcast to the public live. Transcripts of the conference will be posted on our website once they are available. I'd like to point out Rule 16 of our Rules of Practice and Procedure, and that relates to transcripts. Rule 16 outlines a process in case of a potential transcription error or a correction in statements made in the transcript. So please note that rule, and if you do have any suggestions or submissions for corrections, please make sure you follow the rule that's laid out in the procedure that's laid out in Rule 16. At this stage, I'd like to acknowledge and introduce a number of individuals who play an important role in this proceeding. Tanya Lai is his lead staff, and Laurel Ross is the project manager, and they're sitting beside our counsel, Mr. Cody. And with them are Johanna Bursek, who is our hearing administrator, and Jim Cody, who you've just met, and who's our counsel for this proceeding. Our transcription provider is eDecree, and they're relatively new to our process, and therefore they can't be expected to recognize any of our voices. So it's very important that before you speak, you identify yourself. And that's not just the first time you speak, that's any time you speak. And I would appreciate it if you could do that. Thank you. And finally, and also when you sorry, that's fine. And finally, with regard to breaks, we're going to plan to take a mid-morning break at a natural point, and we're going to try to wrap up by noon, but I certainly don't mean to rush anyone, but just so we have a common expectation, we'll see if we can wrap things up by noon latest. So, Mr. Cody, I'll call for appearances, please. Press the button.
Oh, yeah. I thought I did, actually. Jim Cody, counsel for BCUC. First in the order of appearances is BC Hydro.
Good morning. I am Ian Webb, W-E-B-B, appearing on behalf of British Columbia Hydro and Power Authority, or BC Hydro. I do have a proposed regulatory timetable, which I will hand up at the beginning of my submissions. And I mention that at this point because I would like to speak to all matters at the same time, and I'll speak to that proposed schedule.
That's great. Thank you, Mr. Webb.
Next in the order of appearances is Movement of United Professionals.
Good morning. Jim Quayle, spelled Q-U-A-I-L, representing, I'll give the acronym, which is, or the compressed name of the organization represent, which is Move Up, M-O-V-E-U-P, for the transcript, and the initial M and the U-P are capitalized. So that is the party I'm representing, which is the union that represents the inside workforce of BC Hydro. We are content to proceed with all issues dealt with together, and have nothing to add to the agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Quayle.
I seem to have some issue around this button. Is that on now? Oh, I see. Okay. Next in the order of appearances is Residential Consumer Intervenor Association.
Good morning. Good morning, panel. My name is Michael Walsh. I'm here on behalf of the Residential Consumer Intervenor Association, RCIA. Joining me is Mr. Michael Vaney. My name is W-A-L-S-H, and my colleague Michael Vaney is V-A-N-E-Y. And we have nothing to add to the agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh.
Next in the order of appearances is BC Old Age Pensioners Organization.
Is someone from that organization online? I see there's a message in the chat. Can someone tell me if that has something to do with?
Hmm.
Mr. Chair, Leah Worth here remotely. I was intending to actually attend in person, but I had a car issue. My camera seems to be disabled. It wasn't originally, so I don't know whether there's a technical issue there, but if
Ms. Worth?
there we go. Okay, my mic
Good.
turned off in the middle of the sentence.
Yeah.
Okay. Leah Worth, W-O-R-T-H, first name Leah, L-E-I-G-H-A. I'm here as counsel along with my co-counsel, Ms. Meese, M-I-S, on behalf of BCOAPO et al. We are content to proceed with the issues in one block, as you had suggested this morning. And subject to any questions, those are my opening comments. Thanks, you.
Thanks, Ms. Worth. We have no questions of you at this time.
Thank you.
I think I have it figured out now, Chair, so the microphone, I mean. Next in the order of appearances is the Commercial Energy Consumers Association of BC.
There we go. Okay. Good morning. I'm Patrick Weafer, last name W-E-A-F-E-R, counsel for the Commercial Energy Consumers Association of BC, which I'll refer to as the CEC. With me on the call is, I believe, Janet Rhodes, consultant for the CEC, last name R-H-O-D-E-S. And we are content to proceed with all issues together and nothing to add to the timetable.
Thank you, Mr. Weafer.
Thank you.
Next in the order of appearances is BC Sustainable Energy Association and Vancouver Electric Vehicle Association, a joint intervention.
William Andrews, ANDREWS, representing the BC Sustainable Energy Association and the Vancouver Electric Vehicle Association. Participating also as part of our team is Thomas Hackney, Hackney. I'm content to address all the issues at the same time, and I have nothing to add to the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews.
And the final party in the order of appearances is Brent Lipson and Riverside Energy Systems, joint intervention.
Thank you. I can speak first. I'm Brent Lipson, B-R-E-N-T-L-I-P-S-O-N, joint intervener with Ben Giudici, Riverside Energy Systems, representing the interests of net metering customers, installers, and designers. And we have nothing to add to the agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Lipson. Mr. Giudici, are you?
Yes, I'm Ben Giudici, so I'm the other side of the Lipson Riverside joint intervention. I concur with Mr. Lipson. We don't have anything to add to the agenda at this time. And just for the record, my last name is G like George, I-U-D-I-C-I. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Giudici. Thank you, Mr. Cody. Yeah. Mr. Webb, please continue.
I mentioned I have a proposed regulatory timetable, so I'll hand that out now.
Mr. Cody, look after it. He needs to get his steps in today.
Yeah.
So there's a few items for me to speak to on the proposed regulatory timetable. It may not be entirely self-explanatory to the panel. The first item is on the proposed regulatory timetable refers to, I'm just going to go through them sequentially. That
Sure,
seems logical. Is two IRs, and I'll address each of those in turn. The first is BCUC IR 1.17.2. This IR asked BC Hydro to update Table 4-20 of the application, assuming a flat rate as the default residential rate, and requested a discussion of the results. In its response, BC Hydro indicated that it is unable to complete the requested modeling during the time frame of the Round 1 IR process. The response provides a directional assessment of the results. BCUC staff contacted BC Hydro indicating that staff consider the information requested in that IR to be quite important for the record. And BC Hydro further assessed the work that will be required to complete the requested modeling and confirms that it can provide the information by August 25th, which is next Friday. So that's the first item in the proposed regulatory timetable. There's a second IR reference there, which is BCUC IR 1.38.5. This IR and several others asked BC Hydro about the pros and cons and impediments to making the optional residential time of use rate available to customers on net metering service. In the response, BC Hydro indicated that there's potential opportunity there. However, it may be best to consider a time of use component to net metering service in a planned future proceeding. Subsequent to filing that response, BC Hydro had productive discussions with interveners on the topic, and BC Hydro believes it has figured out a way from a technology standpoint to make this time of use available to residential net metering services as part of this proceeding. BC Hydro is still working out the details and proposes to submit them as a revised response to that IR also on August 25th, next Friday. So that's line item 1 on the proposed regulatory timetable. Given the importance to BCUC staff and interveners of the matters addressed by those 2 supplemental IR responses, BC Hydro expects, maybe assumes, that parties will want the opportunity to submit IRs on that supplemental evidence. And if so, BC Hydro is amenable to a round of IRs just on that supplemental information. And so we have proposed a couple of steps for such an IR process. BCUC and intervener IRs on the supplemental responses September 6th, and BC Hydro responses to those IRs on September 20th. Now we have in the proposed timetable BC Hydro submitting its final argument as well on that same date, September 20th. And so I'll speak to argument phase. BC Hydro has discussed or at least had some engagement with interveners regarding further process for this application. And subject to my earlier submissions regarding the 2 supplemental IR responses, we understand that interveners are content to move to a final arguments phase. They'll speak for themselves, of course, but that's our understanding. The proposed dates that we have in our proposed timetable for arguments have regard to the regulatory timetable for the BCUC proceeding for BC Hydro's 2021 Integrated Resource Plan. Almost all of the interveners in this proceeding are also interveners in that proceeding, and so we've tried to not create undue hardship for anybody in this proposed timetable. So that's the main reason why intervener final arguments are October 6th, we have an oral hearing in the IRP proceeding on the 25th and the 26th, and so that seems like a workable time frame for interveners. Finally, the proposed timetable accommodates a BCUC decision, probably by the end of January 2024 or thereabouts, which should work well for BC Hydro's planned implementation for the optional time of use rate, April of 2024. So those are the considerations that went into this proposal.
What would be the latest time you could get a decision in order to implement for April?
It might depend on how much variance there is between the application and the decision.
Okay.
But
In an ideal world.
in an ideal world, yeah, 2 to 3 months. So
2 months.
yeah. So the January date would be the 3 months, and then
So the end of January, you're saying?
the end of January would be 3 months, and then the end of February would be 2.
You wanted to implement the rates by April 1st, right?
April 1st. Is my math
So
right
the-
there? Maybe my math was wrong.
Well, I think you want the end of January.
Yes,
February,
that's
March.
that's
That-
what
that
we're
only gives you
requesting.
that only gives you 2 months.
That's right. I'm sorry,
So
you're
that-
right.
That's your, that's the end of your window then.
That's the end of the ideal window. Yes, that's correct. Thank you for checking my math.
Thanks.
Subject to any further questions, that's all I have for my submissions.
Tom, do you have any questions? No? No, that's great. Thank you, Mr. Webb. Mr. Cody, an
Well,
exhibit?
I think it's up to Mr. Webb if he wants to mark it as an exhibit.
Sure, yes,
Okay.
yes, please.
We need a number then.
Yes. It'll be exhibit 8. Exhibit B8.
B8?
Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Mr. Quayle.
First tangential comment would be there's recent discussion just now about an ideal world. In an ideal world, we wouldn't need time of use rates, but we live in the world we live in,
Do you?
and that world is changing. I just want to make a brief comment, which in my submission is somewhat germane to the appropriate scale of these proceedings, and that's just how much things have changed. 10 or 12 years ago, time of use rates were a very contentious issue in principle. And in fact, when the government of BC Hydro introduced smart metering, they swore up and down, we don't have time of use in mind. My comment at the time was it's like buying a lot of can openers and saying we don't have any cans. But anyway, the world has changed, and various developments in climate policy, electrification have really impelled the issues in a different direction. And I say this because the sort of compactness of this process today compared to what would have happened had Hydro applied 6 years ago for this is, in my submission, quite dramatic. We are, as my friend Mr. Webb suggested, content to go straight to argument at this point, but we understand there are issues that will be addressed along the way, and we concur with the proposals as to the further IRs dealing with those particular issues. Concerning time constraints, I will be out of the country and not in North America between September 24th and October 13th, and celebrating my 50th wedding anniversary, which I've mentioned in other proceedings, and sorry, just not prepared to modify those plans for this purpose. But the timetable proposed by BC Hydro miraculously works for me, although I'll have to pause in packing my bags to bang out an argument. But I would be able to accommodate myself, and I certainly don't expect the Commission to accommodate me, under this, particularly if BC Hydro's proposal or something similar to it is adopted. And I don't have any other procedural matters to raise at this point.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Quayle. Mr. Walsh?
This is Michael Walsh speaking. So with regards from the proposal from BC Hydro in general, we have no objections. Our CIA has no objections. So in terms of need for further written process, we're comfortable with what was proposed by BC Hydro. No significant time constraints and no further matters to add.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Ms. Worth?
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the panel, and attendees. Leah Worth again, W-O-R-T-H, here speaking for BCUC et al. So it's my understanding that we were to speak to sort of all of the issues here. So I'm going to start by just kind of by stating that later yesterday we got an email from our expert that said that he had gone through the IR responses from BC Hydro, in addition to sort of the ones that they had identified in, I believe it was Exhibit B6, that they indicated that they were going to be filing updates regarding. And we do have some concerns from sort of our expert's perspective. He's identified a number where he feels that further clarification is required. And then where reconciliation between two or more information requests is actually required. And he notes that revisions have been made to the application to reflect the Commission decision in order G154-23 on BC Hydro's fiscal 2023 to fiscal 2025 revenue requirements application. There was a data error that BC Hydro discovered in the electric vehicle charging load distribution that has a minor impact to the assessment results of the optional time of use rate. There was an updated expected cost estimate for the time-based billing infrastructure, the TBBI project cost. A modified electric vehicle stock forecast on BC Hydro's April 2023 load forecast that was filed in the IRP as part of the signpost update that could have an impact here. And then updated reference prices, including the long run marginal generation energy and capacity costs, as well as the non-bulk transmission and distributions as per the signpost update that were filed in the IRP recently. So as a result of these particular issues, our position on this is that we would request a second run of IRs. And I realize this is sort of late notice. Hydro didn't have this information. We didn't actually have this information from our expert until late yesterday. While BC Hydro is expecting to provide corrections and updates in various IR responses next week, or should its application be granted to provide them on Friday, August 23rd or 25th, it's not clear whether the additional tables and figures that have been identified by BC Hydro would actually address all of these issues, and then also what would occur in regards to sort of the clarifications that our expert has actually sort of found in this disconnect between certain IR responses. So we've got that sort of situation, and then we've also got the information responses in the BC Hydro transmission service rate design application have provided Hydro's view on considerations that should go into designing default versus optional rates, and their adherence to or application of these considerations to the application here are also something that BCOAPO feels needs to now be tested, and that wasn't something that we were able to do in IR1. In regards to any significant time constraints, unfortunately, Mr. Harper, our expert, is dealing with a vacation schedule, and his vacation schedule is August 28th through September 10th, plus subsequent time requirements during September related to sort of the IRP. Of course, there's that oral process that's scheduled for the 25th and 26th, the BC Hydro Transmission Service RDA, and we have submissions that are due on that. The BC Hydro Capital Filing Guidelines. And it would be difficult for us to utilize Mr. Harper properly in order to actually have a second round of IRs if our application for that is granted until the last week of September. I mean, Ms. Meese and I are certainly capable of drafting some level of IRs, but when it comes to sort of the technical aspects, we rely rather heavily on Mr. Harper for that. So I wanted to bring that to this panel's attention. If there's any other procedural matters that we have, no, not really. We want to sort of ask if BC Hydro could provide input on the priority that it's attached to its various ongoing proceedings in order for the BC Utilities Commission and for this panel to look to those particular issues when it's establishing a timeline for this particular process, since the timelines for the other ones are set at this time. Subject to any questions, those are our submissions.
Thank you, Ms. Worth. I do have a couple of questions. So if there was a second round of IRs, then are you proposing it be limited to those scope items that you just, and I didn't write them all down, but what you just went through, the ones related to the RRA, and then presumably some related to the transmission rate design? Or let me rephrase that. Would you be willing to put forward a proposed scope, or are you proposing that a second round of IRs be on anything?
I mean, I did try to make sure that we had some specifics here for you, but in regards to sort of the general comments that I came with before, which was the sort of inconsistencies between IR responses and some clarification questions, I'm not sure that the issues that I identified, you know, the sort of stock forecast and then the ones that you've sort of mentioned as well, Mr. Chair, I don't know that those are fully addressed in those two general comments. If I could have a chance to confer with my expert, hopefully in the next few minutes, I could hopefully clarify that for you. But at this time, I wouldn't feel comfortable limiting it.
Okay. If you are going to talk to your expert, then perhaps you could also answer my second question, is that if your expert's vacation starts on August 28th, would it not be, if we were to have a second round of IRs, would it not be possible for him to, or her to draft the IRs before the 28th?
Unfortunately, he's in hearings quite a bit until that point, but I will put that to him as well in this inquiry.
Okay. Well, that would be appreciated then if you could. If you do have further information, we'll allow you back in the schedule here to bring it forward to us before we start the reply arguments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Do you have any questions?
I do, as Commissioner Fung, Ms. Worth. In terms of, I guess, what you've just said about availability of your expert, can you give us an idea, perhaps you need to confer with the expert on this, as to when you anticipate being able to produce these IRs, given what BC Hydro has said about the need for a decision by the end of January?
I apologize if I wasn't clear. I did try to say that given sort of his period of being off the grid, and then also the responsibilities that we have in other cases, that we don't think we would be able to get them done until the last week of September. At least the technical aspect of them, yes.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Tom, do you have any questions? No. Okay, thank you, Ms. Worth.
Thank you.
Mr. Weaver.
Good morning. Patrick Weaver, counsel for the CEC. The CEC agrees with the proposal put forward by BC Hydro. We don't have any significant time constraints, and there's no other procedural matters to address.
Thank you, Mr. Weaver.
Thank you.
Mr. Andrews? Mr. Andrews, are you online?
Yes, Andrews, ANDREWS. The BC Sustainable Energy Association and the Vancouver Electric Vehicle Association support BC Hydro's proposal and don't have a material time constraints like all the other interveners, presumably. BCSEA and Viva have challenges meeting the resource requirements of being involved in various commission proceedings. In relation to OAPO's request that we've heard so far, I would say BCSEA and Viva do not object to the request for a second round of IRs. However, BCSEA and Viva are very concerned that the commission issue a decision in time for hydro to implement the optional residential time of use rate if it is approved on April 1st. So my submission would be just emphasizing the importance to my clients of a decision by the commission in time for implementation, if that is the commission's decision. So those are my comments for now, subject to any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews. Mr. Lipson? Mr. Lipson, are you both speaking, or is one of you speaking on your behalf?
Mr. Giudice will speak for us this time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair and Committee. It's Ben Giudice, Giudici. I just wanted to say that Mr. Lipson and I are in agreement and support BC Hydro's suggestion. The only thing I would respectfully ask is whether the group could consider extending the response time to their supplemental work regarding IR 1.38.5 by an additional week to September 13th. Since 1.38.5 specifically addresses the net metering participation concerns that Mr. Lipson and I raised, we would appreciate having that extra time to formulate our response. Fundamentally, we don't have objections to a second round of IRs if the group decided that was important. However, I agree with the previous speaker that time is of the essence here, and we would hope to see decisions made and BC Hydro given the opportunity to implement at the very latest by April the 1st.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Giudice. Mr. Cody, does staff have any submissions?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Good morning. My name is Tanya Lai, spelled L-A-I, and I'm speaking on behalf of BCUC staff. BCUC staff's submission is that it would be beneficial to have a second round of written IRs. This submission takes into consideration the corrections made in the RATA filed by BC Hydro on August 14th, BC Hydro's new proposal to not have the time of use rate subject to the DAR, BC Hydro's update to the time of use rate modeling results to reflect, among other items, the corrections filed and BC Hydro's signpost update in the IRP proceeding. In addition, staff would like the opportunity to ask clarification questions on various topics after reviewing the responses to IR number 1. For these reasons, staff submits that the second round of written IR should not be restricted in scope. If it is not restricted in scope, then staff submits that BC Hydro's proposed timeline of September 6 should be extended.
Sorry. Okay. Right. So you said if it's not restricted in scope. And if it is restricted in scope,
If it is restricted in scope
Depends
as
on the
proposed
scope
by BC
restrictions,
Hydro,
yeah,
yes.
yeah.
The
Okay. That's it. Do you have-
staff, yep. Is there any questions from the panel?
Commissioner Fung, Ms. Lai, what sort of extension are you contemplating if it's not limited in scope for your IRs?
If it's not limited in scope, similar to BCO APO submission, we would appreciate the end of September.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lai, I appreciate it. I'd like to take a short break. I'd like to talk to the panel, if I could, before we go back up the list. So if we take, maybe we take 10 minutes. We have a little room down the hall. We'll head off to that, and we'll come back at 9:20.
Okay.
Thanks.
All rise.
So I'm going to call us back to order again, please. Thank you, Mr. Webb. We didn't want to start without you, so thank you for joining us. And Mr. Webb, we'd like to start. We have a question to ask of you, if we could, please. So we'd like to know, what's the magic about April the 1st? Why does an optional rate, I appreciate it's the beginning of your fiscal year, but,
Correct.
But why does it matter? I mean, it's an optional rate. You know, it could be implemented on April 1st and maybe nobody subscribes till June the 15th.
Yeah, I don't think I have a complete answer for you, but one is it's beginning of BC Hydro's fiscal year, right. And so there's material administrative convenience for BC Hydro of implementing on that date around forecasting and budgeting and all sorts of things of that nature. The other thing I know arising from the BC Hydro Integrated Resource Plan is this rate it has a purpose, which is to achieve capacity savings, and delayed implementation is delayed capacity savings. A month is probably not going to make the lights go out. Yeah. But
so the options aren't April 1st, 2024 or April 1st, 2025 then?
I believe that's correct,
or April
yes.
1st, 2024 or May 1st, 2024?
I believe that's correct. Like April 1st would be helpful to BC Hydro. It's not an absolute imperative.
But it would be helpful for administrative reasons and would save presumably some administrative money. Is that?
I believe so. I can't say that it's a lot, but that's BC Hydro's preference. But you're right. I believe that it could be done May 1st or June 1st.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Webb. We're just going to take a minute to talk
okay.
To you.
Thank you.
Please don't go away. Okay, thank you, Mr. Webb. That's fine. Everyone will have an opportunity to respond to that as we go through our reply.
Could I just make one very quick point that interveners may want to address in their replies? And since I'm last, I thought I'd put this on people's radar. The schedule that we proposed has intervener final arguments on October 6th. Thanksgiving is October 9th.
Yes.
And so, for example, if their date for their arguments gets pushed back a week, that's into the week of Thanksgiving, and they may want to comment on that.
Okay, thank you for pointing that out. Staff, given what BC Hydro has just said, do you have any supplemental submissions to make on that or not?
Tanya Lai, BCUC staff. We do not have any supplemental.
Thanks, Ms. Lai. Okay, so going back up the order of appearances then, Ben Gudici, please. Riverside Energy.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I don't think I have anything to add to the discussion. As I said earlier, Mr. Lipson and I wouldn't have any objections to the process being drawn out further if it more adequately addresses the concerns of other interveners. Mr. Lipson may also have some comments. I'm not sure.
Nothing to add to Mr. Gidicci's comments. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Mr. Andrews.
For BC, SEA, and Viva, there's a very serious concern that if this rate is going to be approved, that it happen in a timely way. And I note that the application was filed on March 3rd, 2023. And while I'm sympathetic to the desire for clarification of answers on the first round of information requests, one thing that I've noticed is that it hasn't been suggested, and perhaps this will come up in the responses to my remarks now, but it hasn't been suggested that anybody's final argument or the content of their final argument hinges on getting these clarifications or additional responses in a second round of information and requests. And I'm not opposed to a second round of information requests, but I think that the commission really needs to look at how long it takes to process an application, and that if at all possible, a decision that would allow implementation by April 1st strikes me, and speaking on behalf of my clients, as entirely, as entirely reasonable. And I would not, I would submit that it would be very disappointing for the commission to allow clarifications that are not tied to substantive issues on whether a rate or decision, the content of a decision, to further extend the review and the implementation of action. The time for action on these climate change issues is now, and that there is urgency involved. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a moment. Thank you, Mr. Andrews. You know, I appreciate those comments, and I would assure you that the commission is very sensitive to the amount of time that our processes take. And you know, as you well know yourself, it is difficult to shorten the time of processes given the constraints of administrative law that we operate under. But that said, I note that in this matter, BC Hydro didn't apply for an interim optional time of use rate, and that would have been a mechanism available to them. And normally that is part of an application for a rate design, typically, or a rate increase, even in a revenue requirement. So the panel hasn't really turned its mind to that, and none of the parties in this proceeding presumably have either. But it would be something we would be open to. And an optional time of use rate on an interim basis, given the test is not as stringent on a permanent rate, we could consider doing that on an expedited basis. And then we could move forward and do a further, more in-depth exploration of issues that interveners do consider relevant and important, and that would presumably contribute to some tweaking of the rate at a later date. Now, I'm making some assumptions here that that Hydro would be able to implement a time of use rate in a more timely fashion. They could presumably get it in place before the end of the year, and then if, as and when a permanent rate that was different from that was approved, could make that change to their system I'm assuming here in weeks now, and not in the months it would take to implement the time of use rate the first time. And I'm seeing people shaking their heads, so I shouldn't assume so much. I agree. But what I'll do is the panel would like to throw that option into the mix, and if parties would like to comment on that, we could dice and slice this proceeding in a slightly different way, and we could look at implementing the applied for rate on an interim basis right away, and then we could move on with the rest of the proceeding looking at the permanent rate. And I'll go back to the beginning of the line now and let people make submissions on that. So, Mr. Andrews, I'm hopeful that will address your concerns to some extent.
Would you like me to respond now, or wait until
Let's
we hear
wait.
from Hydro?
I'll go back to staff and see if they have comments on that. Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Cody, I'm sorry. Commissioner Losky just pointed something out. Perhaps we should get Hydro's response to that first. Yeah. It might be more helpful.
I'm advised of, I think it's 3 points. First is that implementing the optional time of use rate even on an interim basis prior to April 1st of 2024 is quite impractical due to technology requirements and adjustments that need to be made to technology. For example, through the SAP systems and billing systems that BC Hydro has. There is an impediment or a issue as well with a kind of a two-step. It's an optional rate that BC Hydro is going to try to encourage customers to take up. And if they take it up on a basis of a certain set of assumptions that then change, there's some concerns there. Otherwise, the idea of a April 1st interim implementation followed by a final decision, that could work, I think. I don't want to suggest, BC Hydro is applying for that. I think they need to consider it further, but that would seem to be an option.
So if we did look at that further, then would you agree that we should turn our minds to that immediately in this proceeding and say seek submissions on it and make that determination now, and then we can determine whether so you would have some certainty at least on where you're going on the interim rate.
Yeah, I take your point, Mr. Chair, that it relates to the process that you would be setting down and what's anticipated to happen through that April 1st date, and so you need a better answer from BC Hydro than I'm able to provide today, I think, in terms of any other. Just give me one moment. Yeah, I think BC Hydro would need some time to engage with further people internally back at home base and advise if it's workable or if there are even further problems that those of us here today aren't aware of.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Webb. So we'll go back up. We'll start back up the list for the third time, or the second time.
So I think if we're returning to schedule, next would be the commercial energy consumers.
Well, no, we're going to go back again to staff.
Oh, I see.
Yeah,
Okay.
Tanya Lai, BCUC staff. Staff's submission is that we have similar concerns as raised by BC Hydro with respect to an interim time of use rate. Does the panel have any questions?
You said you had similar concerns
Yeah.
with BC Hydro. Do you have additional concerns?
No, it's the same concerns raised by BC Hydro.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Riverside Energy, please.
Yes, Lipson, I can speak to that. We have some concerns with a potential interim rate. Our submission focuses on the impacts on net metering customers of them being excluded from the time of use rate. And if those terms are extended to an interim rate, it represents a substantial risk to deployment of solar and also a loss of benefits, access to the cheaper rates for net metering customers. So we would need an opportunity to comment on any potential interim rate.
Yeah, as I understand it, BC Hydro is now proposing that net metering customers be included in the rate. So if one took the view of that it was an amendment to the application, would you be prepared to comment on the appropriateness of that proposed rate as an interim rate? Not necessarily now, but
Yes, and from what we understand is being submitted, we do still have some concerns about the way that export
Right.
energy is treated.
Okay, thank you.
So we,
Yeah, thanks. Hey, is that, okay, Mr. Andrews?
Yes, first, I think BCSEA and Viva would have quite serious concerns about the prospect of an interim approval of an optional renewable time of use rate from the perspective of whether such an option could be successfully marketed. That is, the public needs to know, like, is this something that is real and long term that we can think about and sign up for, or why are we being asked to make our decision about something that might change at any given point in the very immediate future? Second, my submission would be in terms of the length of the commission process, is that the commission process really would have to be considered from the time that the filing was made to the time that a final decision was made. And in that sense, having an interim decision would not shorten the time of the commission's review. Third, to re-emphasize, I'm not opposed to a second round of information requests if that is required for the panel to have all of the information and evidence that it needs in order to make a good decision. I'm not opposed at all. And if the panel requires information to make the decision that it sees itself making, and that pushes the length of the proceeding beyond an April 1st start date, then so be it. That's what has to be. My comment is that I haven't heard people argue yet that that the second round of information requests is necessary for the content of the commission's final decision or for the content of people's final arguments. If that argument is made, then the panel may or may not accept that. So I am not at all opposed to the commission having the evidence that it needs to make its decision. And I guess to summarize and come back to my first point, I don't think that an interim approval would have the desirable effect that may be intended. And I would reiterate that the length of the commission's review ought to be, in this case, measured between the time of the filing and the time of a final decision. And if it takes a long time because of the need to get evidence related to the content of that decision, then so be it. But it should not, in my submission, the proceeding should not be lengthened because of the perfect getting in the way of the good. Those are my submissions.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews. Mr. Weaver? Sorry, did you guys have questions?
Unfortunately, I have not had a chance to connect with my client on any instructions with respect to an interim rate proposal, so don't have comments at this time, but would reserve the right to file comments to the extent that we were proceeding with an interim rate proposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weaver. Ms. Worth?
Mr. Chair, members of the panel, I'm mindful of earlier comments that Mr. Quayle made regarding sort of the differences in the world that we're living in right now as opposed to 10 years ago or even 6 years ago, the issues that I identified in my submissions this morning were not ones that have no bearing on the the issues that are before this panel and the issues that are of concern to our clients and potentially others. And I certainly note that the commission staff seem to share some of the same kind of concerns that I had identified in my submissions. I want to kind of speak to the timing issue that Mr. Andrews identified. He had sort of said, you know, we need to just barrel ahead, and you know, perfection is not possible or desirable in this particular case because, you know, the world is burning and, you know, whatever else. That's not what we're asking for. We're not asking for perfection. What we are is we're asking for a second round of IRs in order to address significant concerns. And I appreciated the suggestion that you had, Mr. Chair, members of the panel, about an interim rate. However, I do note that there has already been sufficient concerns kind of identified by the parties in reply that because there doesn't seem to be an indication that a delay would be overly long. As you had noted in your comments, Mr. Chair, it's not as though this is either April 1st, 2024 or April 1st, 2025. So I would suggest that perhaps the panel look to whether there is a sufficiently urgent call for the implementation of this rate that would warrant kicking that potential hornet's nest. And of course, it is up to Hydro whether they would make that application for an interim rate. But I'm not going to speak to, you know, whether I think that an interim rate would be a good idea or not. I think that there's been sufficient concerns already identified that I think that cost-benefit analysis should be something that the panel look to. Now, in regards to Mr. Andrews' comments in general, he's indicated that it's of concern to him that parties have not yet argued that the information that we've identified, and I presented a list of specifics as well as sort of the general, like, you know, facts that there's clarifications and reconciliations between various answers that remained outstanding. I would think that Mr. Andrews and other parties to this process would understand that commission staff, as well as we as representatives for BCUAPO, are approaching this with that in mind. We would not come to this panel and ask for a second round of IRs to explore issues that did not actually potentially go to our ability to file a final submission in this. And I note that the PCA, or I guess PCA would apply to this. PCA rules are crafted in a manner that assumes that if we do not actually deal with issues that are central to our clients' concerns and that do not add anything to the Commission's understanding of the issues, that we are at risk of not getting cost award or having reduced cost awards. So I think it's a little odd to hear that from Mr. Andrews, but I can assure the panel that in any questions that we might ask if a second round of IRs is granted, that we would be doing so in order to clear up evidence that we and our expert feel are necessary points to address before we do actually finalize our position on things with our clients. So yeah, we're not seeking process for the sake of process. These are things that we want to address and that we feel we need to address in order to ensure that BC Hydro takes measured, effective, and fair steps to address climate change as well as its needs going forward. So subject to any questions the panel might have, those are my submissions in reply.
Thank you, Ms. Worth.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Walsh.
Thank you, panel. With regards to the idea of an interim rate, RCIA would have concerns. To quickly summarize, one would be the marketing, the public interaction, which has been highlighted by both BC Hydro and Mr. Andrews. And the second one would be concerns we would have about project implementation efficiency. So for example, whether the project would start, stop, get redefined, or even if there's a question of a fait accompli, where they implement, where BC Hydro, let's say, implements something that because it's implemented de facto supersedes what the decision would be from the panel.
Thank you. I think those are really good questions, Mr. Walsh, and I am going to ask Mr. Webb to try and address that when you when we get back up to you, because those are questions that I have also. I appreciate that going out to the public with an interim time of use rate, could be problematic because of the uncertainty. But an interim time of use rate would provide certainty to BC Hydro that there will be a time of use rate in place, and which I am then going to ask you, does that provide you with any implementation efficiencies that you could start as soon as possible on your systems programming that you need to change it? And does that then give you a leg up on implementing the actual final rate that you will go out to customers with? Because otherwise, as I understand from what you've said before, you've got to wait until our final decision comes out, and then it's 3 months from that final decision until you get the rate in place. So if our final decision doesn't come out till March, you're not going to get it in place till June. But if you could start on the work now, and then our final decision came out in early March, would you have the rate in place by earlier than June? And you may not be able to answer those questions, but it would be helpful to the panel if you could. Not right now, but when you get there.
I just rise to acknowledge the question, and we'll discuss and do our best.
Sure, appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Sorry to interrupt there.
No problem. Yeah. Thank you.
Mr. Yes.
Mr. Chair, we've just been advised that Leah Worth, counsel for the BC Old Age Pensioners Organization, has heard from her expert.
Yes.
So if you want to deal with that now,
sure, in
this order.
Thanks, Ms. Worth. Yes, please. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the panel. I put the two questions that you had to him, and although he did say that many of the questions that that he had identified as potential areas for IRs were likely to fall within the scope of the specific list that I had provided. There were ones that, with the clarifications and reconciliations that potentially would not. So we are still requesting a more general scope for the second round of IRs. And in regards to the second question that that the panel had, Commissioner Fung, the timing of Mr. Harper's schedule is that he's in hearings from in Ontario that last week before he leaves, and then before he leaves, he's actually got IRs for the FBC annual review, BC Hydro's transmission service RDA, BC Hydro's Lador and Strathcona update application, as well as materials that he has to provide to a colleague for another OEB process for while he's gone. So unfortunately, he doesn't feel that he would be able to in any way address the second round of IRs in the time, even if it was a limited scope. I hope that that's of some assistance to the panel.
Thank you, Ms. Worth.
Thank you.
Just a minute, sorry. Ms. Worth, since you have the floor here, I'll start with you, but I think the panel has another question that was probably going to mean we'll go back down the list again, but what about an oral process here? Would that, you know, a workshop or something to get these questions answered, is that something that's workable?
It would depend on the timing, Mr. Chair. Really, we would do our utmost to address, you know, if the panel decided that that it wanted to do that, perhaps by providing Hydro with our questions ahead of time, so that the oral process could be, you know, more efficient. I would be a little reluctant to sort of engage in a process where we basically, you know, we're in a workshop and then having to try to, after the fact, follow up on issues like those that I had identified, simply because unless we're able to have our expert attend as well, it could be difficult for us as council to appreciate whether Mr. Harper's questions are being answered to the degree that he would need in order to offer his expert opinions. But we would seek to find a time with the commission, if that was the way that you decided to go, that would allow Mr. Harper to attend remotely.
Thank you.
So we're certainly open to that, and we're open to working with the panel and with this BC Hydro to make sure that it's as efficient a process as possible.
Thank you. Mr. Cody, did you have a?
No, I have no comment.
Okay. Okay, so I'm not sure how we want to deal with this. The submissions on the oral process, I want to make sure everybody has an opportunity, but we're also halfway through the other round here. So perhaps again we could start. Mr. Webb, do you want to lead off with any comments on an oral?
So, Mr. Chair, let me just address that issue. So next up in the replies was Movement of United Professionals, right. Mr. Quayle, and Mr. Quayle has submissions on that particular issue, well, independent of your inquiry. All right.
Yes, this is a thought that occurred to me, and during the break, I ran it by my friends Mr. Cody and Mr. Webb. I'm not saying they've endorsed it, but just sort of planted this notion. To back up a little bit, the main process we have for discovery in regulatory proceedings is what in the rules of court are written interrogatories, information requests. Another significant, in fact, larger process in judicial proceedings is an examination for discovery, which is a live oral process. And it occurred to me that it may be more efficient in this situation to consider, instead of scheduling information requests as is proposed, that we convene for what we might call a workshop, but a process where parties orally present the questions that they would have presented in writing to BC Hydro. And this format would provide a clearinghouse to address these issues. So the issues that can be readily resolved on the spot, that can all be cleared out of the way. The issues that require Hydro to go back, roll up their sleeves and modify tables, so on, that would be all the business that's left to resolve that inquiry process. So I had thought of this as a way of modifying what would happen that's suggested on September 6th, some interviews commission and intervener IRs into a workshop or an in-person process of that nature. Would enable, in my submission, consider to basically incorporate the broader subject matters that have been raised within something at least resembling this timeline. This does not address the logistical issues that BCOAPO has. Regardless of that, this may be a vehicle for the Commission to consider, and I know the question of the Commission's processes is in the air, and there's a pending process to review that. So whether or not that's something that's plugged in on September 6th or at some other point, depending on how the Commission is inclined to deal with the concerns that my friend Ms. Worth has raised, maybe a question more of timing than of substance. But there can be an awful lot of time spent in the Commission's processes in dealing with very fine detail. And I'll just speak very generally to that, and maybe most of this I'll save to the pending process, but there is a need for proportionality of process. And we all need to be thinking of ways for that to happen, that a great deal of time and resources are spent on issues that may have limited materiality. For example, take a recent example, in Hydro's recent 23 to 25 revenue requirements, a very large process to deal with depreciation rates. Huge amounts of resources went into that. The net impact, the change in the needle on revenue requirements was in the order of $7 million, which is a cup of coffee per customer. In my submission. So I do not prejudge in any way the materiality of the issues that remain on the table to be addressed. Some of them may be issues that at the end of the day would move the needle enough to be that through the lens of proportionality, the process should be further enlarged to incorporate them. But in my submission, this is significant. And if it's a matter of fine-tuning the calibration of the rates, sometimes I put a little differently than my friend Mr. Andrews, though I agree with many of his comments. Getting it right is a different thing from getting it perfect, and getting it perfect is an impossibility, given the subject. There's no such thing as a perfect rate. But getting a rate that will function to achieve what's intended to achieve in a fair, reasonable way in compliance with the Act, that's what this is about. And we can spend a lot of time fine-tuning, honing something which in fact is illusory. On the question of an interim optional rate, just one other issue I want to flag with this, maybe more germane to whether a rate of this, an application of this nature initially could have been brought coupled with an application for an interim rate, is that adopting the interim rate is in effect a final decision on the rate. All that's left is the fine-tuning. So that can be done, but it would need to be explicitly recognized across the Rubicon, we're getting a residential optional time of use rate. None of the interveners oppose that, but of course, we don't vote on what your decision you're going to make in these proceedings, but simply flag that issue. So those are I think that's everything I have to say at this point. I hope my comments are helpful. But I would urge the Commission to consider experimentation with different modes of a proceeding to try to improve the efficiency of many of our processes. I'll say again, an awful lot of time and resources go into pursuing very small rabbit holes.
Thank you, Mr. Quill. That's very helpful.
I don't know if there's any questions from the panel.
No, looks good. So I'm going to let Mr. Webb address some of the questions that have been raised and make any further comments. And then after that, I'm going to open the floor, so to speak, to anyone that has not had an opportunity to reply to anything that's been brought up.
I'd like to start by inviting you to provide me any guidance in terms of issues you'd like me to address in a sequence. I've got a chicken scratch of notes here. But I can start with the idea of an oral process. BC Hydro doesn't have any sort of principled objection to such a process. We do think that there are some practical concerns, one being our understanding and what we heard from BCOAPO and from the BCUC staff in terms of the matters that they want to pursue through further IRs is reconciliation and clarification, I think, of numbers. And that isn't necessarily a subject matter that's conducive to an oral process. The other is there are many proceedings all stacking up on top of each other over the next couple of months, as you were well aware, commissioners. And so finding a time that would work for everybody seems rather daunting. So those are my, I think, only comments on that. Open to the idea, but it may not be practical.
Thank you. How about the answers to your systems programming of
Yes.
option?
Yes, thank you. A few points on that. One is BC Hydro is already moving forward with everything that it can based on what it has, what it knows, and what it has in terms of approvals from the commission. So there obviously has to be some hedging around moving forward too quickly without an approval, but it's kind of doing everything that it can already. So on the very narrow question of would some sort of BCUC approval allow BC Hydro to move things forward, probably not a big material difference there. The three things that are required to actually, setting aside BCUC approval, that are actually required to implement the optional rate is the IT, the information technology, the marketing materials and how that's rolled out, and then the customer enrollment process. And so IT work, at least, preliminary design, that's all underway already. Some preliminary work in the marketing area is underway already. And it's what's left to be done, which is the kind of 2 to 3 months I mentioned earlier this morning.
I'm going to invite any other party to reply, if that's Mr. Weber. And then I'll give you an opportunity to reply to them.
Yep, that's fine.
Okay. Is there anything else that anyone would like to say? Does staff, for example, have any comments on an oral process for your questions?
Tanya Lai, BCUC staff. BCUC staff acknowledges that an oral process can normally provide efficiencies in certain types of proceedings. However, in our view, the nature of this application is quite technical and may require modeling. So staff's preference is for a written process. Staff also agrees with BC Hydro's concerns raised regarding the current number of regulatory proceedings and the challenges with including an oral process in the regulatory proceeding.
So to Mr. Quayle's comment about, I'll paraphrase him, getting some of the low-hanging fruit with an oral process, is it your suggestion that wouldn't have a material effect on your questions?
I think it would be challenging to add an oral process on top of a written process.
Okay, thank you, Ms.
Thank you.
I see CEC has her hand up. Mr. Craig? David Craig?
Yes, thank you. I've just put you on hold, Julie. Comments. Thank you for allowing the comments. With regard to scheduling dates, we have no concerns with whatever dates the commission chooses to schedule. The potential for an interim rate is not attractive to the CEC. We believe that would come without sufficient certainty to allow the development of the detail, which would be needed for promoting it as well as programming it and implementing it. We think the concerns that are raised about the urgency of environmental issues need to be put in the context for the commission of the degree to which the environment will be impacted by a couple of months with regard to a rate here for a worldwide issue. It is really infinitesimal, and the regulatory issues that the commission is dealing with should be more conditioned with getting a rate implemented and a rate that is right and fair. With regard to the length of the commission's processes, they take the time they take, and the commission is regularly dealing with the requirements and the efficiencies as we go along, and you're discussing them today. We think that the commission's length of processes are the necessary regulatory requirements to get the work of the commission done and to enable the interveners to have a fair role in the process. With regard to the workshop proposal, we note that for a workshop proposal, everybody that's involved would have to be there for it, but for an IR process, only the people that need to work on it and need to do that. And there's logistical issues in getting a workshop ready, and I don't think from a timing point of view it's going to make a big difference. And I think that with regard to a second round of information requests, we've heard that some are of interest to interveners. I think the commission should be open to that. The commercial energy consumers may participate in it, but don't have a driving interest in it at this point in time. And I would align with the interests that were raised with regard to whether or not we're trying for too much perfection. I don't think that's the case. I think it's a new concept coming forward, and we should get it right and should get it fair. And if there's significant intervener interests, those should be weighed in. The issue, unlike one point of view that was put forward, is not just a panel issue. The interveners are participants in the process and need to have a fair opportunity to raise issues that they think are meaningful to the implementation of the rate. And Hydro's flexibility with regard to what it's going to do and timing to get things done seems entirely appropriate to us. Those are all the comments that we would provide.
Thank you, Mr. Craig. Any other intervener have any?
If I may.
Please go ahead.
William Andrews for BCSEA and Vancouver Electric Vehicle Association. First, I want to just reiterate what I did say before, is that I have not spoken against a second round of information requests. I would elaborate that the staff asking for a second round of information requests carries considerable weight to me in terms of the merit of it. My point was that the weight of an argument for additional process is less if there aren't specifics provided as to how the evidence that would be garnered through additional process would affect either an intervener or the panel's consideration of the issues. But that doesn't mean that taking someone's argument on faith that they wouldn't have asked for a second round if they didn't think it was important. That's certainly part of a normal argument. My comment was that it doesn't make it as strong as if the person making the argument, the party making the argument, is able to say exactly what the consequences would be. I note that the issue really with the second round, the possibility of a second round of information requests is not so much whether there would be one, but its scope and the timing of it. And my comment about the keeping the proceeding moving goes to the timing of it. And that if it turns out that to have that process work practically means extending the time for final arguments and hence the timing for commission decision, then so be it. As I've said, that's the way it has to be. I would echo Mr. Quayle's general point that there are times at which the parties and the commission in our processes spend a lot of time on things that either in hindsight or perhaps even in contemplation don't meet a proportionality test. But I'm not saying that that applies here in this specific request for second round of IRs. And so I guess my concluding submission would be to keep the process simple. I don't think an oral hearing or oral process workshop, whatever, would help. I don't think an interim decision would help. So my submission again is what it has been on the need for an IR2 and the scheduling of that. BCSEA and Viva have no objections to any reasonable scheduling. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews. Any other intervener have any further comments? Mr. Webb, I'll let you wrap us up then.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am going to limit these final comments to reply to the interveners. My first submission reply is to echo Mr. Andrews' submissions around the scope of a second round of IRs. In BC Hydro's proposed timetable, we have included a round of IRs with a limited scope, and so it may be that we're talking about whether that scope should be bigger and whether the timeline should be different than the proposed regulatory timetable. It may boil down to that. In terms of scope of a second round of IRs, we've identified 2 IRs that BC Hydro is going to supplement the responses to, and absolutely agree that those would be within the scope. The other is we do agree with and support Mr. Andrews' submissions that what I heard from both BCUC staff and the BCOAPO is their further inquiry that they want to make is more technical, reconciliation of numbers, clarification of numbers, and we do question the value of that towards a commission decision, which is not to say it shouldn't be allowed, but perhaps some constraints and time frame should be put.
Mr. Webb, I'm sorry, I have to interrupt you here.
Yeah.
Is that not the commission's? Is it not the commission's role though, to do due diligence on an application and verify that the numbers are correct and that the rate reflects the correct numbers?
Absolutely.
I'm a little
absolutely
concerned about your submission.
Maybe my submission was inaccurate, or I could do with clarification. It's what I agree with what you just said, Mr. Chair, for sure. Okay. It's whether the clarification aids with the determination of an appropriate rate. That's really the distinction I'm making.
Okay.
And I'm not sure that the clarification sought does that.
Thank you.
So in terms of a schedule, for all of the reasons discussed earlier, BC Hydro's preference is not to extend the schedule out too much. We've proposed a date for intervenor IRs of September 6th. Mr. Lipson mentioned September 13th. BC Hydro doesn't have any objection to extending those proposed dates by a week. You know, I did mention earlier that would mean that interveners would be filing their arguments the week of Thanksgiving, but that's not BC Hydro's concern per se. So that would be an option to extend the schedule for IRs and arguments by a week. Extending the schedule for intervenor IRs to the end of September seems a bit excessive. Not unsympathetic to BCOAPO's expert, but there's lots of other people involved in this proceeding, of course. And what we might propose is, there is a third IR. I mentioned 2 IRs that BC Hydro will supplement. There's a third one, which is BCUC IR 1.2.1. We're not proposing to supplement that response, but what that response contains is all of the errata and the updates. So perhaps an option would be to limit the scope of the second round of IRs to the 2 IRs I mentioned earlier, plus BCUC IR 1.2.1 to follow up on those 3 IRs. Perhaps that would be workable within the time frame of the schedule we proposed, or moving those dates back by a week.
Okay.
I think I've covered everything. Any further questions?
Commissioner Fung speaking. I appreciate your accommodation, at least insofar as the BCUC staff concerns are. But what about BC OEPO? I believe that their request is actually broader than those 3 areas, if I heard Ms. Worth correctly.
I'm not sure. It might be, but what and Mr. Andrews is suggesting is that maybe there's an opportunity to narrow the focus of their IRs. They may have, Ms. Worth mentioned that her expert, had identified some apparent inconsistencies that require reconciliation. Is that critical for the record? Or maybe that actually arises from the BCUC IR I mentioned. I don't know. I'm trying to come up with a proposal that meets most of what everybody's asking for. It probably doesn't give everybody everything they want.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Webb.
Thank you.
Well, that brings us to the end of our discussion today. I'd like to thank everyone for your participation and your thoughtful submissions. And for those of you that are traveling, I wish you a safe journey home, and wish you all a good weekend. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the panel.